Greetings, building science enthusiasts, and welcome back to the Building Science Podcast. This episode is brought to you by Bowtex Systems, a Texas-based manufacturer of a high-performance insulated concrete wall system. Here on the Building Science Podcast, we stress the importance of the building enclosure to the overall comfort, health, safety, durability, and efficiency of our buildings. And you've also heard us say that the enclosure needs to do the heavy lifting. In fact, the enclosure may be the most important first decision you make on your next construction project. We believe that some of the best solutions for a high-performance building enclosure are monolithic mass wall assemblies, like the Bowtex wall system. Bowtex walls include structure, enclosure, and insulation all in one assembly and is installed by a single trade. Manufactured locally here in Central Texas, fast to construct, and labor-friendly, Bowtex walls deliver competitive first costs and provide a lifetime of savings on energy and maintenance costs. Better buildings start with better walls. To learn more about how to design and build better buildings using Bowtex, go to bowtexsystems.com/building science. That's how they'll know that we sent you. That's BAUTEX systems.com/building science. Enjoy the episode.
Welcome to the Building Science Podcast.
Welcome to the Building Science Podcast.
Bringing the human factor to construction, design, and architecture. Brought to you by Positive Energy in Austin, Texas. Hey listeners, welcome back. This is another live episode from the Texas Society of Architects Expo and Convention, so prepare for a little background noise. All right, welcome back listeners. This is your producer Miguel here, and I'm lucky to have a very special guest, Dr. Jules Elkins from the University of Texas.
Good morning.
And Jules just did a wonderful talk here at the TXA convention with Laura Brett, who's an interior designer here in Austin. And the talk was focused on indoor air quality. And what better way to sort of segue into a discussion about the multiple dimensions of beauty that we've been discussing here at the TXA than talking about how the environment affects your health. So that's what I would like to touch on today, Jules, is from your perspective, what does multiple dimensions of beauty mean with regard to a space and what we bring into it and how that affects people's health?
And that is a very good question. You motivated this by saying indoor air quality. And so when I think about beauty, I think about a clean and healthy indoor space. And most people define that as indoor air quality, but I want to look at it from a different endpoint, which is indoor environmental quality. Today in the talk, I talked a lot about dust. So a low-hanging fruit, I think, of green building is volatile organic compounds, right? What we breathe in our air. But I think most people are not as aware of the chemicals that are semi-volatile compounds, which are chemicals that are heavier and have a higher vapor point, which is a technical way of saying they stay put longer in building materials and they migrate out into our dust rather than into our air. And so we get exposed to these really highly through what we ingest and our surfaces. Kids are extremely vulnerable to the health effects of dust. And so I'm very interested in looking at some of these less obvious health endpoints, but really important ones with respect to chemical exposure and dust. And that sounds kind of dirty, and since we're talking about beauty, that's important. The kinds of chemicals that are semi-volatile chemicals are chemicals like phthalates, which I think people are pretty familiar with at this point, plasticizers, pesticides, flame retardants, products of things that we burn. These are all chemicals that have well-known carcinogenic properties, but I think less well-known is that they have some neurotoxic effects for kids as well. And it's kids who are vulnerable, and it's kids who are so highly exposed because of their behavior. And so that's something that I'm thinking a lot with respect to beauty.
Absolutely. That's wonderful. And, on a lot of our projects, we tend to have the opportunity to have more educational conversations with project teams up front because we're getting involved during the design stages with architects, with the builder, with the installer. And we're not only talking about pushing the limits of sort of thermal comfort, but we're also talking about the health outcomes that we can solve in the design phases. And so obviously from Positive Energy's perspective, we're talking about mechanical systems, we're talking about good filtration, particularly when it comes to controlling humidity and really thinking about how we're filtering for particulate matter, PM 2.5, et cetera. So we fully are on board with the idea that beauty is so far beyond just what you see, right? And more project teams are getting it. But I'm curious about your experience with consulting work, with your students at the University of Texas. What is sort of the zeitgeist right now with regard to how they're thinking about health in indoor spaces?
You know, it's funny that you asked that. I lack that perspective because I'm mired in so deep talking about these things.
You're in the trenches.
I'm in the trenches. And whenever I come to a conference like this, I look around me and I say, am I looking like I have two heads? The things I'm talking about, is anybody thinking the same way I am? But I think they are. So what I wanted to mention with respect to you talking about thermal comfort is when you think about design and designing away chemicals, is if you think about getting the humidity right in the first place, it removes the need for a lot of these chemicals that are going to be mold and mildew inhibitors in the first place. Absolutely. And these are things that are some big bad chemicals that do migrate out into the air and into the dust. And so you're making a healthier space by design right up front.
Absolutely. And even ASHRAE, it's a group of engineers who has now changed their language with regard to the relationship between humidity and asthma from correlative to causal. And that's a huge, huge deal. And, thinking in your talk about, you spoke about the rising temperatures with plasticizers, with phthalate-producing materials in buildings. That's obviously a huge concern. So if you're not accurately controlling the temperature in a space or the surface temperatures in a space, you can immediately experience, and may not even know you're experiencing, really negative health outcomes. So when we're talking about projects and we're talking about sort of thinking ahead and preventing negative health outcomes, obviously, one of the big questions we need to ask is what are we bringing into the space, and how are those materials going to behave with according to the laws of physics, and potentially, negate any kind of forethought that we had put into it with regard to filtration, with good ventilation. Obviously, if there's off-gassing going on, that's going to be a big problem. So tell us a little bit about what you know about how building materials behave.
That's a really important issue. So we've done work from kids in schools, what they're bringing in from when they enter the door to when they leave at the end of the day. We've looked at low-income housing units, about how a building occupant meaningfully influences the space. You can build as healthy and as green as you want, but then if the occupants meaningfully change what's going on in the space, it can have some very significant health consequences. As an example, one of the assessments we do is we start at the door and we watch when people walk in. And what's really interesting is a really simple thing like what's on the bottom of your shoes matters a great deal to what ends up being in the space. Earlier I was talking about dust. Well, if you think about what's on the bottom of your shoes and what you've walked in before you've entered, think just about, for example, walking across a blacktop road. The pavement sealers, there's compounds called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, many of which are known human carcinogens, are endocrine disruptors, there's suspected neurotoxicants or developmental toxicants, and the list goes on. The pesticides that you track in, herbicides that people have sprayed, and these things go into the carpeting that you're on. Is a very interesting study was looking at if you shook out all the dust of an old carpet, what remained would have to be disposed of as hazardous waste. It had so many contaminants in it.
Whoa, that's insane.
It's insane. So simple things like having people remove their shoes at the doors, that's a potent way of reducing what you're bringing into a space. If you think about what you burn, for example, candles. People love candles, and people think they're getting around the issue of what candles are burning by bringing in the vaporizers or the
right, yeah. The essential oil diffusers.
Diffusers is the word I was looking for. Yeah. But these things are also off-gassing all sorts of things. So you look at, there's a really interesting study done that said if you're in a room and you light a candle, there's this flare-up of what you're being exposed to and what it's putting off into the environment. That is the equivalent in your exposure profile to all of the pollution being put off by all of the coal-fired power plants in Texas, because that's a diffuse exposure exposure, you're in an enclosed and small room that's poorly ventilated.
Oh my God, that's insane, but it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, it can be really significant.
So to that point, there are also a lot of decisions made through the design phase, especially with interior designers, about furniture, about what kinds of woods and laminates might be brought into the space. Tell us a little bit about what you know about those materials and how they might impact a project.
So I like to look at things that are a little bit less obvious. I think with veneers and laminates, is as long as they are specified as being zero VOC, they're probably okay to bring into a space. I think less obvious are things like upholstered furniture and carpeting. Is typical carpeting and upholstered furniture will have in it flame retardants, which are not inert, and they off-gas, and they migrate out into the dust and have pretty significant health effects. So much so that California has now backed off on its standards and is outlawing a lot of them. And a lot of manufacturers are voluntarily removing them from their products because of this really significant health profile. Nonetheless, as most furnishings have these, if they're not the halogenated flame retardants, they're replacement flame retardants in them. But then we think about non-stick is in stain treatment. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants a couch where someone's going to spill a glass of wine and that's the end of the couch. Mm-hmm. And so we treat them with non-stick surfaces, and these are called perfluorinated chemicals. And these also are suspected endocrine disruptors, they're suspected neurotoxicants, and suspected reproductive toxicants. And so looking for alternatives like hardwood flooring, natural surfaces, natural wool carpeting, removes a lot of those exposures. One thing I think people don't think about is the health effects of plastics. A colleague has a test house where they do these interesting studies, and one of his graduate students did a study where they took a PVC shower curtain into the bathroom and opened up the plastic that it was in and shook it out and installed it, and then they were able to trace using tissue samples and hair samples and saliva samples that the chemicals and the PVCs, the phthalates, the additives, and the plasticizers went through every tissue in their body within 26 seconds. So these are really potent chemicals.
That is... we've had a lot of really interesting conversations on this podcast, and as we as a company start to get to know more of the issues that pertain to indoor air quality, indoor environmental quality, we sort of start to realize how little we actually know, and we're trafficking in these waters pretty often. And so it's just remarkable to talk to you about this stuff because and I think the listeners will agree, there's a lot to unpack here, and I think it's worth spending some time really thinking deeply about these issues. Which, I want to know, how would you recommend that an interior designer or an architect who's handling the interiors actually make a good selection? Like, what do you do? where do we go?
You hire me.
Okay, there you go.
These are really difficult and complicated waters right now. There's no agreed upon standard. There's a whole bunch of different groups that are vying for sort of supremacy and uniformity in this area. So these are very complicated issues right now. So that's not easy. There are websites, resources out there, and I think one place to look is to start is at the Healthy Building Network. That's a landing point that can help with education. But I would like to say that all of these things that we're talking about highlight the absolute necessity for good ventilation and making sure that obviously you don't...
You hear that, guys? Good ventilation.
Obviously you don't want to bring these products in the first place, but that's probably impossible. So then what you do after matters a lot. And so ventilation is the holy grail.
I agree completely. Well, I don't want to keep you too much more. I know it's been a long day, and I know you're very tired, and so am I. And this has been a marathon of a couple of days for Christoph and I, so thank you so much for your time. I'll give you the last word, if you'd like it. Anything you want to tell the world? Ventilate. You want to leave it at that?
I don't have a last word.
Very good. All right, it's time for bed, everybody. Thanks so much for listening, and a big thanks to the Texas Society of Architects and to our sponsor, Bautex.